the elections on Tuesday.
Okay. And then Ukraine successes.
Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of Pax Americana. So sorry that we're a little late today. I'm Julie Roginski here with Olga Lautman. I just got off a other Substack Live with Joel Rubin, which is why I'm late. Olga, you and I are both traveling. I'm in a hotel room in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You are down south visiting family, so we don't have much time. We only have about half an hour, 40 minutes or so. So let's get going. Want to talk to you about these elections that are taking place in Democratic primaries and how they affect Ukraine, because I think this is a very underreported story that's very important to talk about. There is a succession of elected people who are now winning primaries. Adalizia Chevalier up in New York 13, other people running, the Justice Democrats effectively running everywhere, who, in addition to everything that they're talking about with respect to Israel/Palestine, are also saying that they're not going to fund any aid for Ukraine because they don't want to spend any money on, it's babies, not bombs, right? We want to spend money on stuff here and not stuff on, and not money on bombs, as they call it, for Ukraine. Thoughts? I don't know. Can you hear me?
Look, it's problematic, and I can hear you.
Yep.
Do you hear me?
Yep, I can. Go ahead.
Okay. It's very problematic, and this, very erratic palette of candidates that we have from the extreme far right and the extreme far left, because these aren't progressive. These are like the tankies, who love Stalin, who love Marxism, who are anti, everything. This is, just shows that we have a very unhealthy, besides what Trump is doing, and, Trump is just a barometer of what's been happening in the U.S. It shows that over the past decade, and probably past 2008, after the financial crisis, that things just went so far off that the majority of people got left behind, whereas a small handful, profited off of everything. And you saw this greater and greater divide. And when you have, a mass population who can't afford to pay their bills and who has to choose between electric and, gas, which one am I going to have shut off this month? How am I going to afford food? I have to work 3 jobs. And then you have a handful who are basically taking the, 90-something% of the wealth in this country. This is where you start seeing people going into, gravitating towards candidates like Trump, even though he's a con man. But this is where you saw in 2015, this far right, breaking off and becoming extremely extreme. And you saw all the moderate, centrist Republicans being pushed aside. Now we're seeing the same exact thing happening here. And it's also the frustration because centrist Democrats are not fighting hard enough, or if they are, they're not making it known. And this is frustrating people, that they feel, that everything is being torn down. I mean, I do my tracker every day. It's horrific. Like 700,000 kids got kicked off SNAP over the past few weeks. These are 700,000 kids who are not now, we don't even know how they're going to eat, all for tax benefits for the rich. And people are not making enough noise. And I think it's just a reaction to basically people feeling that the system is broken. The system is not working. And, if the system's not working, tear it all down and restart. But at the same time, it's very dangerous because, with this, just like with the MAGA movement, you saw a lot of darkness coming in, a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of, anti-Ukraine, anti-Europe, anti-NATO. So you see the same exact sentiments. And I've always said that when you take, and again, this is not the progressive movement, this is the extreme far left. When you take them and the extreme far right, you end up with a horseshoe theory where they literally end up agreeing on everything and, being very much in line. So I think that is what is happening, and it's a very big problem. And, centrist Dems really need to realize and wake up. They can't do things the old way. They need to fire all their consultants in DC and actually go back to basics of actually going to talk to their base and communicating directly and trying to get, see what they need to do to make them happy.
Yeah, I mean, look, I believe, and we don't have to dwell on this, that this all goes back to 2008 when Barack Obama, 2009 when Barack Obama failed to hold anybody accountable for what happened with the 2008 financial crisis. I mean, he needed to throw one hostage on the tarmac, failed to do that, seated his cabinet with people like Tim Geithner, who was the former chairman of Goldman Sachs. That was a huge mistake. Even if he thought that he was qualified for it, which he obviously was, but it's just a bad message to send. And that's gotten us to this point now, almost 20 years later. And so I think that's something to bear in mind. However, I will say for anybody who even thinks remotely that we are spending money that we could be spending on SNAP to support Ukraine, friends, I understand what's going on. There was also a similar sentiment after the Great Depression, where you had an isolationist wing here that didn't want to spend any money on Lend-Lease and other places because they wanted to spend the money here on Americans, for Americans. But nevertheless, we needed to do Lend-Lease and ultimately just to help stop the Nazis. And when we were unsuccessful in doing that, the war came to our shores. This war will come to our shores eventually if we don't help the Ukrainians now. And we can do both things at once. We can eat and we can chew gum and walk at the same time. We can defund ICE and take that money and send it to Ukraine. Like, there's a million things that we can do here. Just lost Olga. But nevertheless, I think it's very, very, very important that we ensure that we have people here who understand that we need to fund Ukraine. We need to fund it. If we don't, this is the most black and white issue I can think of in my lifetime. Olga's gone. I think we lost her. But I think it's so critical for people here to understand we need to fund Ukraine. If we don't, the war is going to come to us, because eventually Russia, if it takes Ukraine, is going to take Poland. Either we are part of NATO or we're not part of NATO. If you want to join Donald Trump and pull out of NATO, and if you're a Democrat that believes that, then you're psychotic, as far as I'm concerned, because NATO exists to stop Russia from advancing into Western Europe. Eventually, the war will come here, and unlike World War II, nuclear weapons exist. So just think about that. All right, Olga, let's talk about Ukraine. I thought it was very interesting that Trump...
Yeah,
go ahead.
Actually, this is a perfect segment, because 2008 not only was where you saw this divide happening, of this class divide, where you had a handful, the top 5 or 7% who were banking, literally making bank and walking to the bank, filling their bank accounts with money, while the rest, struggled to and lost homes. I remember how many people, after the subprime mortgages crisis, how many people lost their homes. I mean, it was atrocious. But at the same time, you had Russia at the time, who just had invaded Georgia and was not held accountable. So here you had the same year where you have, people who are struggling and whatnot. The same year, Russia invaded a sovereign country, the first time since World War II, on European soil, occupied, I believe, 15-20% of Georgia, and they were never held accountable. And as a result, this is where we had 2014, where Russia was emboldened and decided to invade in 2014, invade Ukraine. This is where an emboldened Russia that was never held accountable decided to send its advisors in 2008, capitalizing off of the pain of Americans who were struggling after and lost, the shirt off their back off after the financial crisis, where they started sending, people here to the United States to start carrying out acts measures and polarizing us and making a complete divide along class, race, money, everything, you name it, whatever fracture they found, they worked on it. And this is where an emboldened Russia decided, again, because they were never held accountable in 2008, to start attacking the Polish election in 2015, the United States election in 2015, Brexit, and on and on and on and on, to the point this is why we are here with a con artist sitting in the White House who wants to basically upend, world order, sees himself, which frankly is, laughable, but sees himself even greater than Stalin. Stalin murdered millions upon millions of people, upwards of 10 million people between Ukrainians during the genocide, Holodomor, and then his own Russians. I mean, Stalin was ruthless. He didn't like a general. He just shot him, executed him on the spot. So this is how we ended up here. And this is a perfect, segue to that, because 2008 is where you actually saw this happening, both on the domestic front, both the rise of populism, you saw the Tea Party, because people were just struggling. And, when you feel you're doing everything right, you're paying your taxes, you're doing everything right, you're putting money into the Social Security, you're doing everything that the government is telling you to do, and then suddenly you lose it all, and then you have a handful of people, including Trump, who paid more taxes to China, for his companies than he did in the United States. So, I mean, here he paid what, $700 over a decade in taxes, whereas in China he paid tens of thousands of dollars. So this just shows you where, why we're here. And the last thing I'll add, with Obama, he brought in Jake Sullivan and, and others who did not act on Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Well, guess what? The same people who Biden brought in, Jake Sullivan, Feiner, Blinken, who were so panicked about escalation management and didn't want to piss off Russia and tied Ukraine's hands and didn't allow it to properly defend its country and stop the genocide. You see now Ukraine, who is untied, and how far they are going. And guess what? They've crossed every red line that Moscow has put. And guess what? The world is still here. We're still doing. That's it.
I mean,
so
it's pretty incredible. I thought it was notable this week that Trump yesterday, I believe, was asked about Zelensky and called him very courageous and said that he's holding his own. And I have a theory, which I wrote about earlier this week, which I want to run past you and to get your thoughts. I believe that when Zelensky saw Trump give Iran everything they want, because Iran basically gave him the middle finger and did not bend the knee to him. And then when he saw Netanyahu bending the knee to Trump and giving Trump, acquiescing to a lot of what Trump wanted, which made Trump trash him and think less of him, that Zelensky, if you noticed, they bombed the shit out of that energy plant outside Moscow, less than 10 kilometers from the Kremlin, as soon as the ink was dry on the MOU in in Iran. And my view is that Zelensky has understood that Trump does not respect people who bend the knee. He respects people who behave in strongman ways. And bombing the shit out of an energy plant in the capital of Russia is something that Trump would respect. And indeed, I think that turned out to be true, because all of a sudden Trump is now singing a very different tune on Ukraine and on Zelensky. And To which I say, great. If it's not great for humanity in the sense that like now everybody's going to try to out savage each other, but it is interesting how people are behaving from my perspective in response to what Trump finds to be a masculine, manly, go get him, rah rah kind of thing. What are your thoughts on that?
I think partly that's true, but I can tell you, talking to Ukrainians and working on these issues, um, it basically was after. I mean, first of all, Ukrainians have, and this is with the most utmost respect, because regardless of the frustration, for instance, with Biden, withholding things, taking time, delivering tanks, certain missiles, saying you can't strike here, you can, like, here's a long range missile, or middle range, it wasn't even long range, but you can put it into Crimea. Like, really? You know, Besides that frustration, I think, Ukrainians pretty much by 2024 realized that, again, not the first time, that United States is not a reliable partner because they have their own national security interests, which do not align with Ukraine. Ukraine has to defend its sovereignty, and they need to do it by all means. Whereas with the United States, they don't want to, rock the boat and anger Russia and escalate. And it was the wrong advisors, because unfortunately, I've talked to many in DC, and they still have the old Soviet mentality, which is a very big
Right.
problem. So it's very that hesitation. But more so after the Helsinki summit, after Trump rolled out the red carpet, Ukrainians pretty much got the idea. I mean, Zelensky was kicked out of the Oval Office. Then by August, you had Putin, with a red carpet rolled in, being praised, and treated like he's a rock star. And that's it. And they played the game as far as with attending all the negotiations and this and that. But like I've said a million times before, Zelensky doesn't have the power to cede even 1 inch of territory. Just like the US president, I'm sure, doesn't have the power to, give away any of American territory. Like, there's actual procedure for it in the Constitution, just like in Ukraine. If Ukraine wants to cede land, they have to have a referendum throughout the country, and the Ukrainians have to, agree. So after the negotiations went nowhere, and Ukraine showed up to every single one, Russia kept fucking around, and no, well, this doesn't work, and and whatnot. That's where you saw by January them really, really raising the pressure on Russia and saying, you know what, at this point, that's it. And by February, when Trump got occupied with bombing Iran at the end of February, Ukrainians are like, good, he's occupied right now. We can start doing what we need to do. And by March, April, May, we've seen everything. I mean, I don't think Ukraine, are you kidding? Do you think Europe or the United States would have allowed Ukraine to strike the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, like the oil refinery out in St. Petersburg, when the biggest forum is starting with people, from around the world, like walking in? They would have never allowed it. And here Ukraine did it. And they've been escalating. And if you notice, I've been writing a lot about it. There's a very specific strategy. Because if you notice, they are trying to cut off all the logistics, the fuel supply, everything, to make especially Crimea and other occupied territories uninhabitable.
Yep.
And right now, you have a point where, Russians who were bussed in after the invasion, who are now trying to get out off the island and like get me back to, Russia, because there's no fuel on the island. And everything they're doing is very, very strategic. It looks like random strikes here, there, but everything is very strategic. And if you look at the bigger picture, they're basically putting a noose around Crimea, which, by the way, in 2014 and 15, I remember telling people Ukrainians are not giving up Crimea. And DC, people in DC laughing like, this is like a fairy tale. Okay, like
Yeah.
keep dreaming, but here we are.
Well, listen, the one thing that I have to say has always been a problem for Americans consistently on both sides of the aisle when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Russia, when it comes to foreign policy more broadly, is a failure of imagination. I mean, after 2008, okay, fine. He walked into Georgia and then took whatever. But that's that. That was a Russian enclave and whatever. Okay, well, he took Crimea, but that's it. Crimea used to belong to Russia before Khrushchev gave it to the Ukrainians. So okay, fine. Those are mostly Russians, ethnic Russians. So let's let him take it. Oh, okay, he's walking into the Donbass. Well, okay, those are also, a lot of them are ethnic Russians. That's on the border with Russia. Okay, fine. But what they don't, and of course, Ukraine was going to lose because, of course, Ukraine was going to lose. Because Ukraine was a small country compared to Russia and the military and so on and so forth. And then Zelensky is a nice guy and Putin's a savage. So of course they were going to lose because might makes right. All of this was always wrong. And so to go back to our earlier conversation about how, well, we can't help Ukraine. We can't spend American money on Ukraine because, bomb babies, not bombs. Friends, if you don't do this, it's going to get worse. They are never going to stop. Much like this bullshit agreement that we have with Iran right now or this war with Iran right now, showed Iran something that no amount of military might could have shown them. Wait a second, if you just put a few mines in the Strait of Hormuz, yes, you're going to shut down your own oil exports, but you're going to harm the shit out of the United States. And unlike despotic countries, whether it's Russia or Ukraine or Saudi or any of these other places, we can't absorb the hit because there's always another election around the corner. And so the American president, regardless of who that person is always going to blink because consumers are going to want cheap gas, cheap food, and farmers are going to want cheap food exports. So all of this means that people like China that can absorb hits understand that if you want to tariff us, go ahead, but you guys will blink first because you want your soybeans exported because guess who votes for Donald Trump? Iowa farmers. Guess who votes for Mike Johnson? Louisiana farmers. Where soy is a huge, huge crop. And all of this is like, it's so easy to understand our scam here. It's so easy to understand how to get us that they don't have to spend one dime on their military to do it. All they need are a couple of mines, right? And what's the alternative? What, are we going to drop a nuke on them? Of course we're not. So we have no clout. And that's always something that I think people intellectually understood, but this war is really exposed. I mean, 100%, this war is absolutely exposed. And for all that, the Israelis...
And exposed with Trump. Because this is...
Go ahead. Oh, Olga's gone. So look, from my perspective, all of this is of a piece, and Zelensky, to his credit, understands that. He's not asking permission anymore. I think Zelensky really had an epiphany of some sort after he got humiliated by Vance and Trump, and Rubio didn't do anything to stop it in February of 16. Hey,
the greater power don't want me to talk.
Go ahead, Olga.
I'm saying this is Trump, because Trump is the one who alienated our allies. And I can promise you, not Bush, not Clinton, not any other Republican, or Democrat for that matter, would ever dream of going to bomb Iran on their own with Israel. They would have, if they decided this is what needs to be done, they would have assembled a coalition and had, France, who has their capabilities, Germany that has their capabilities, the Koreans, the Japanese, and actually put together a coalition to squeeze Iran financially, economically, militarily, and whatnot. But Trump went in on his own, not understanding the region, not understanding, that you can bomb Iran until, kingdom come. And that's not really going to do anything because they don't care. They have a different ideology, just like you could starve Russians. I mean, Russians are trained for centuries to stand in line and wait for, breadcrumbs of food. And if they have to revert to that, it's in the DNA.
There goes Olga. Well, I think I understand the point that she was trying to make, which is effectively that you cannot harm Russians. Russians are born to suffer. If you ever read any Russian literature, you understand very clearly that Russians understand that suffering is part of the human condition. They lived through World War II and the starvation there. They lived through certainly, if you know about the siege of Leningrad, which was probably the biggest genocide of World War II after the Holocaust. Olga's right. I was just finishing your thought, Olga, which is that Russians kind of are born to suffer, so they understand. But so are Ukrainians, right? Like Ukrainians also.
Yeah,
it's part of the whole. So finish your thought there. Sorry, I think I finished it for you.
No, and just thank you. But another thing I want to say is, and this goes again to all presidents. This goes to Biden. This goes to, Obama. This goes to, obviously Trump aren't even considered American president, honestly. But this goes to the Republican Party. That while, the U.S. has been following the proper rules and norms and laws of the international order and whatnot, you have Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran coming together already for years. And just to reaffirm your point that the war is going to come to us, and it has come to us. Who do you think provided the targeting info to kill 13 American soldiers in Kuwait? Russia. They were working very closely with Iran, helping provide targeting information. And you have this happening, this axis of evil working together. So while we are scattered and, now completely isolated and scattered, under Biden, and with Europe, I blame Europe as well. They don't want to, do anything. They don't even want to shoot down a drone that's crossing their territory, not to anger Russia and not to escalate. At the same time, you have North Korea, Ukraine here again. You have Ukraine who is fighting North troops and
well, I think Olga, once again, seems to be gone. She seems to be frozen. All right, you guys, this is, I think, a little painful for all of us here because I'm in a hotel room in Cambridge, Massachusetts with not the best Wi-Fi. Olga is down south with not the best Wi-Fi. I'm trying to bring her back, but she seems to be stuck. So I'm going to say that this is a very abbreviated version of Pax Americana today. Deeply sorry for the Wi-Fi connections. Thank you for sticking with us. For everybody who has, I'm going to just leave you with this. If you are a Democrat and you are voting in primaries, there are still some primaries to go, including very, very pivotal primaries in Michigan that are playing out in August. I beg you, look beyond the rhetoric just on oh, there you are. I was about to finish this up because this is getting painful. So I think we should just, because we have to go in 5 minutes anyway, so we should probably just finish this. I was going to say, if you're going to vote, there's Michigan primaries coming up in August and other places. Please look beyond the Israel-Palestine stuff and look at these candidates, because the same ones who don't, these Justice Democrats, it's not just about Israel-Palestine. It's also about the fact that they do not want to spend a dime helping the Ukrainians. And if you think that this is not the most moral, just intervention of our lifetime. I mean, literally, I just said this with, I was just on with Joel Rubin. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very convoluted. It's very, very, very um, uh, complicated. This is not complicated. This is very black and white. This is as black and white as the Nazi Axis versus the Allies in 1939 to 45. So please just do look at what people are doing. So there you go.
And I just want to add that, for anyone who thinks, we shouldn't support overseas, and in general, I mean, it could be today it's Ukraine, tomorrow it could be France, Poland, Estonia, another NATO country. For anyone who thinks, oh, this is over the pond and, we really don't have to worry. I remember a few years ago working on reports where, Cubans were going to training with Russia on drones in Ukraine for the purpose of Russia then using them here. You have Russia working with Mexican cartels, same exact thing, and training them on drones. So, I mean, Mexico is like right over the border. I mean, literally, we're connected to Mexico. So we have to, worry. I mean, Russia's reach, unfortunately, they don't have a good military, but they're excellent at shadow warfare, as we've seen their reach around the globe, whether Africa, whether across Europe, whether the Middle East. And we have to worry that their hand, besides the information warfare and the, election interference and everything else happening in US, that they can absolutely launch drones here from Cuba, from Mexico, that they can absolutely help kill American soldiers across the Middle East, that they were paying bounties to kill Americans in Afghanistan. And you had, Russian, opposition investigative journalists who found the companies that were being used to pay Taliban militants to kill Americans in Afghanistan. So, I mean, maybe we're not going to have tanks rolling across the American border, but now this is a complete different world, and we can see with Iran, and we see what's happening, with Ukraine, and now in Russia. Ukraine is not rolling tanks across Russian border. Ukraine is sending swarms of drones, whether it's to Siberia or Moscow or St. Petersburg. So we're in a different world. Like, it's not, we have to reimagine of what we view war as. And like you said, throwing a mine and having insurance companies say, nope, we're not insuring these ships to cross, the Strait of Hormuz, or God forbid if they do it in front of Yemen, the Houthis, that's all it takes. That's economic warfare, and that will bring the world, as it did, on their knees. And I mean, one thing Trump, he should have never gotten us into this, but one thing he himself acknowledged, that we were literally weeks away, from our reserves being emptied. We have been at the lowest level in like 4 decades. And, and not to mention what was happening across Asia. They were the first ones who had to shorten their work days, and whatnot, because they didn't have enough energy supply to keep the countries running, and they had only an X amount of reserves, all from a few mines. So we need to reimagine, what warfare looks like now, because it's not going to be, tanks rolling into America. It's not going to be tanks rolling into France. It could be drones swarming France and hitting residential buildings. And what are we going to do? Send $1 million, $2 million missiles to knock down a $10,000 drone like the U.S. did in Iran. So that's to finish that up. Are 100% right that this is something that will affect us. We cannot be isolationist, and this is why these candidates, there is a line between us defending our homeland, defending our national security interest abroad, and at the same time feeding our people and providing education. And I mean, I think the pressure should go on the billionaires, who just pay your fair share of taxes. Imagine if, Bezos paid his fair share of taxes. That's, going to give an increase to how people,
All right, Olga,
social studies or whatnot.
you are coming in and out, and also I promised you that you'd be out of
Bye.
here by 11:50, even if you're in
Yeah.
mid-sentence. So I'm going to cut you off, and I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody else. Olga, I think we're back next week, and hopefully with a much better Wi-Fi
Yes,
connection
I
for both
think.
of us.
I don't
I think
know.
we'll both,
I'm not
well,
sure.
okay, well, I will be back in New York, I think. I'm finally leaving this hotel room where I've been like a hostage for the last, I don't know how long. Okay, everybody. Great, good to see you all, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.